Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for getting the first component of your term project in. I'm reading through those right now, and I'm going to get you some feedback and pointers on those ASAP. For the time being, though, I've given you this week a couple readings on people trying to figure out, well, what do you do when you've got a conflict of duties, where you've got certain moral obligations or moral duties in your role as a professional that come into conflict with one another. So one is kind of a case study of something that's come up in the last few months, where you've got medical care providers trying to weigh out, gosh, what about my duties to my patients versus my duty to my family? Do I go in and treat patients even if it means that I might be endangering my family by bringing home an infectious disease to them, or even if I try and balance that out by moving away from my family while I'm treating patients? There's been a lot of doctors living in hotel rooms so they're not endangering their family. Well, they're still harming your family because you're living in a hotel room for 8 months or however long it might be while you're fulfilling your professional roles. So the second article that I give you goes through a couple different theories about, well, how you should or could possibly do that. So I'll just run down in this video a nice little summary of those different views and some of the considerations for and against them. And though these two articles are focused on medical ethics, my hope is that this gives you a way of thinking about some of the obligations and moral duties that might crop up in your particular case studies, and gives you a way and a method for thinking about how to possibly resolve some of those conflicting duties. So, in this article that looks at the different theories of how to do this, the first view that they consider is this compensation view. So let's get a concrete example on the table here. So imagine that you are a military psychiatrist. So your job is providing psychological therapy for members of the armed service. As such, you have this professional duty to keep your sessions confidential, to not tell other people what your patients disclose to you in your session. But suppose that one of your patients comes to you, and as they're talking to you, they talk about how, a lot of times they just feel really, really depressed, and when they feel depressed, they just feel like, what would really just like make them feel better is to just bomb the shit out of like other countries or something like that. And so now as a psychiatrist, you're thinking, okay, I've got this duty not to reveal what my patient has told me, but I also know that this patient is up for a promotion to general, and I also have this duty to make sure that the military remains an effective institution and that we don't unnecessarily bomb people that shouldn't be bombed. And so it seems like maybe I have an obligation to let the folks who are doing the hiring know that this patient of mine is probably not in a good mental state to be doing the duties of a general. But in order to fulfill that obligation to my institutional duties, I'd have to break my obligation to keep my patient's information private or confidential. And now the compensation view says, okay, we've got this conflict of these two different duties. The compensation view says, well, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're going to be breaking one of your duties one way or the other. You're going to be doing something wrong. Either you're going to be betraying your patient by revealing their confidential information, or you'll be betraying the military by allowing them to potentially hire someone who's going to cause real harm in their new role. And the compensation view says, look, you've just got to break one of those moral duties and then be on the hook for it. So this, Eriksen says, well, it seems plausible in a way. Like, you really do have these two different duties that are in conflict with one another. Though you might think it just seems wrong to think that you just can't do anything right in this situation. It seems like, look, you've been put in this intolerable situation. It doesn't make sense to blame you for choosing one of these things, since you have to choose. So then you might think that you need a second theory that's not going to lead to that kind of odd conclusion. So there's this unity view. And this unity view says, yeah, you're right. We shouldn't be saying that you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. There must be a right decision you can make when you have these two different duties that come into conflict. So the example that Eriksen uses here is one in which you've got a professor who's reading over a paper that another professor wrote, and as they're reading this paper, they're thinking, ugh, this is really poorly done paper. It's going to be embarrassing if you submit this to a journal. It might really ruin your reputation. On the other hand, I don't really want to tell you that because, it seems kind of mean and it might hurt your feelings if I tell you that this thing you've been spending the last 3 months working on is just really terrible. So again, we've got this conflict of two duties. On the one hand, a duty to be nice to your colleagues, but on the other hand, a duty to be honest. And it seems like you've got to make a choice here. Well, now the unity view is going to say, actually, there's not even really a conflict here at all, because really your only duty is something like, well, a duty to be helpful. And so to be helpful, the thing you want to do here is to be honest, but, roll out your criticisms in a way that isn't just like mean and blunt, but just be helpful. And if you're helpful, it's not like you're breaking your duty to be honest or breaking your duty to be nice. No, both of those duties just say, well, be nice as long as being nice still allows you to be helpful, or be honest as long as being honest still allows you to be helpful. But if you have to be a little not nice to still be helpful, that's okay. You're not actually breaking any duties. So the unity view says, well, there really never is an actual conflict of duties or obligations. You just have to reconceptualize things so that you can see that, oh yeah, there is just kind of one more overarching duty that you need to be responsive to. We could apply this unity view to the case we were considering before of the military psychiatrist. The unity theorist would say, oh yeah, actually, there isn't really a conflict between your duties of confidentiality and your duty to military effectiveness in this situation. Really, both of these duties just say, well, look, preserve your patient's confidentiality as long as that, say, it allows you to minimize harm, and uphold military effectiveness as long as doing that minimizes harm. And so what you have to do in a case like this is just think, okay, so what action here is going to minimize the harm? Well, since putting this person in charge as a general might lead to the destruction of thousands of innocent persons' lives, I should probably break confidentiality in this case, except I won't really be breaking my duty to confidentiality, because my duty to confidentiality only extends insofar as it's supposed to minimize harm. So this gives us a nice way of thinking about resolving these conflicts by helping to think, there's not really a conflict here. But again, you might think, yeah, but there really does seem to be a conflict here. And in particular, if the psychiatrist goes and breaks confidentiality, the patient's going to say, well, what the heck, man? Like the only reason I told you all this stuff is because I thought that you had this duty to keep everything I said in therapy confidential. You really have broken some sort of duty here. And in fact, Eriksen points out, yeah, if you just think about this and you think, oh yeah, professionals, we're always going to be thinking about all the different possible exceptions to our duties, so then those duties don't really seem like much of a duty or an obligation at all. If we can always just say, oh yeah, I'll keep your information confidential, unless, I really think it shouldn't be confidential. That's not an obligation to keep the things confidential. That's just saying, yeah, I guess I'll just kind of decide whether I want to keep it confidential or not. That's not an obligation or a duty that anyone's going to really trust in. So that's why Eriksen comes up with this thing that they call the restitution view, where he says, all right, that compensation view, the first one we looked at, it got something right. There is, in all of these cases, a real conflict of duties. We can't just dissolve that conflict the way the unity view wanted to dissolve it. We've got to acknowledge that sometimes people are placed in a situation in which, in order to fulfill one obligation, they've got to break with some other obligation. So we acknowledge that there is this conflict, but unlike that compensation view, we don't say that, well, you're just going to do wrong no matter what. We can acknowledge, along with that unity view, that, yeah, there is a real answer that when these two duties come into conflict, one of them is going to outweigh the other one, and so you'll be doing the morally right thing if you say break your duty to confidentiality in order to tell the higher ups don't hire this person because they're not going to do a good job as a general. So you won't have done anything wrong in that sense, the way that the compensation view says. But Eriksen says because you have broken this duty of confidentiality, that now imposes a third duty on you. You've got this duty to restitution, an obligation to reestablish trust with, in this case, your patient, to reestablish trust with the person who, the obligation to whom you've broken with. And Eriksen just points out three different ways that you might be obligated to reestablish this trust. So in the first place, you've got to assure your patient that the reason you violated confidentiality here is nothing personal. You didn't just decide, oh yeah, I decided for my own, inscrutable reasons, I just wanted to break confidentiality here. No, make clear to the patient, look, there's just this general principle that I'm operating under that if any patient comes to me in this context, and I know that they're unqualified for a really serious upper-level military job that involves lots of innocent lives being on the line, in that case, then whether it's you or anyone else, those concerns about my duty to the military, those are going to outweigh my obligations to keep our sessions private. So it's nothing personal having to do with you. It's not, some idiosyncratic thing where I just decided to do it for my own personal gain. It's a more general principle that is causing me to choose one duty, or the duty that I owe to you in this case. In line with this, Eriksen says you should then make sure that you're communicating your expectations about how your obligations to your patients or to the folks that you work with professionally work. And that might involve, just being really transparent and honest with them about the fact that sometimes there are these conflicts that come up, and that you will make a principled decision about which duty to take over the other one, and these are the principles by which you'll make that decision, and communicating that in a way that really respects the patient's ability to make decisions about then, say, what to tell you, given that they now know that sometimes you might break confidentiality if certain conditions obtain. And then finally, Eriksen says, make sure you do all this by making clear that you're not just making mistakes or betraying your patient, but again, taking a very principled stance. So Eriksen says, look, you don't want to say that when you break your obligation with a patient, it's because, oopsie, you made a mistake. No, you are deliberately, seriously considering your obligations to the patient, but then also seriously considering your obligations to other things, like your duty to the military institution as a whole, and that you have carefully, consciously made the decision to favor the one over the other. It's not just a mistake, and so you're giving your patient's concerns real consideration. And then finally, you should also communicate to the patient that you're not betraying the patient. It's not like you had this duty of confidentiality to the patient, and now you're just like saying "fuck you," I don't care about you. No, you're not betraying the patient in that way, but you make clear that, look, I care about you. I have duties to you. I have this obligation to, in general, keep your information secure and confidential. And yet, that duty is part of a larger duty, a larger contract I have with society to, in general, keep all of my patients' information confidential, unless there are these other duties that end out outweighing that duty to confidentiality. So when those other considerations take precedence over your right to confidentiality, it's not because I'm betraying you or somehow not caring about my obligations to you. It's simply because the agreement that we're in from the outset assumes that there are these extenuating circumstances in which one obligation might outweigh the other one. So that's how Eriksen thinks we should treat these conflicts of obligations and moral duties. I'm not sure how helpful it is. It's not entirely clear to me exactly how it contrasts with the unity and the compensation views. I gave you a gloss here about how you might think about that, but hopefully it kind of opens up your thinking and gives you a way to start really, getting into doing some philosophy yourself as you work on your case studies and figure out exactly how to balance some of the competing duties that I'm sure a lot of you are going to confront as you try and figure out what the folks that you're thinking about ought to do.